Japanese architecture and Japanese housing, specifically, more historically, is nature and is in the trees, is of the trees, and made by the trees. So.
Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Wednesday morning room with Tim Sullivan and me, Maya Matsuoka, as your hosts and moderators. You can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Today we have James Scott Brew. James, it's really great to have you here and talk about nature inside, because talking about the buildings in Japan and how Japanese architecture and I think civil building engineering also incorporate nature in and out of the buildings. You already know that James is an architect and he's based in Japan currently. He works for one of the largest Japanese construction companies in the room chat. So James, without any further delay, let's start.
All right, thank you. I have to say, and as I started to say just before we got going here, the effort I have here is really a work in progress. It's not. It's something I've just always. I think I was drawn to Japan probably in part because of nature and Japan's relationship with nature, and it was really through the eyes of Frank Lloyd Wright initially, but ultimately traveling to Japan 37 times before my 38th trip to move here, I really began to see this idea that I've read somewhere that Japanese architecture and Japanese housing, specifically, more historically, is nature and is in the trees, is of the trees, and made by the trees. So and can't be distinguished from trees. Sometimes they say, but of course that's not literally true. But when I think about houses built of paper walls, if you will, or shoji and fusuma, wood and paper and straw and plaster of mud of the earth, really. You're talking about and straw roofs, heavy straw roofs originally, and later tile. Really, it's all natural materials. It's what architecture is moving towards today. More and more, increasingly circular materials and products that don't have toxic chemicals included in them. And all of this isn't to say that Japanese housing and design and construction is perfect today. It's far from that. It's obviously been industrialized like everywhere else. But there is this historical and modern relationship that I saw in the designs that my firm is creating around Japan and the world. But I started to see the patterns of, for example, the sudare, the bamboo screen hanging over the window in an old house, and you see photos of this. Or you pick one up, and today I was surprised once when I saw that you can just pick up the 389 yen sudare at your grocery store on the way to the checkout. But they're still used today. But then we can reinterpret that and use that as a solar screen. The YKK building, for example, I noticed in Tokyo headquarters is a gigantic aluminum three-dimensional screen. It's actually in the shape of a Y if you look at it in plan view. But this sudare is on an entirely glass facade that is facing due west, which most architects would laugh. You never face a building due east or due west because the solar control is impossible. When the sun is at the horizon, either setting or rising, you cannot control it. You'd have to block it out because you'll overheat your building in most cases. And yet this building is one of the best daylit buildings I've ever seen. And the sudare allows views through it, this aluminum facade. And when I first learned of this facade, I asked about cost, like anybody would, and all kinds of things like, why is it necessary? And it's set off from the glass facade, by the way, by about 1.25 meters. So about, 4.5 feet or 4 feet, something like that. And what functional purpose does it serve other than screening this harsh western sun? And I learned later this screen has about 7 different functions, including safety, because it's set off from the facade, thereby creating a balcony on the outside of the building and a place where people can do maintenance. and actually they service mechanicals outside of the building, not inside the building. And it's also lightning protection. It provides a reduction in glare. It actually amplifies the daylight that bounces off the aluminum. There's all kinds of continuous connections this product has to making the people inside feel connected to the outside, which is the point of something we call biophilic design, bringing nature inside. Nature Inside is the title of a book, by the way, by a contact and friend of mine, former colleague at Rocky Mountain Institute, Bill Browning. And this idea of biophilic design certainly can apply to the outdoors and to city and community scale design, but it's really most importantly needed inside our buildings. And here's why. Most people around the world that work in offices don't have access to natural light, and almost 60% have no plants. This is a survey that's done, I don't know if it's regularly recreated, but it was last done I think 2018 or something like that, but it's called the Global Impact of Biophilic Design in the Workplace, and 7,600 people were surveyed from 16 countries around the world and asked about their environment that they work in, how many hours they work and their age and so forth. And just hearing that data that half have no natural light and almost 60% have no plants, they later asked in the survey, what do you want? What's the top 5 things you really want in your office space? And in order, they said natural light, indoor plants, quiet working space, a view outdoors, and bright colors. And every one of those is nature, if you think about it for a while. In quiet working space, we think of nature, sounds of nature, as peaceful and relaxing and calming. And so these ideas aren't something people just made up. They're obviously hardwired in our brains, because we were born into nature and we lived in and with nature, and today we live on nature. And I use a slide for this topic that shows an image of an early human walking in a forest, and then contrasted by half the screen with an aerial view over part of Tokyo. And you just realize why the resiliency of nature and what it provides us with, it's something we lost. And now there are government reports, and this current U.S. administration, just I think late last year, November, put out a document to increase nature-based solutions for things like flood control and so on. And so we're finding historically nature and our connection to it is something we can't forget about. It's like we talk about story. We can't lose this connection to storytelling and story, and we cannot unwire ourselves from nature. And so today I think more and more design professionals around the world are looking for solutions that rely on nature more and increase our access to nature. I don't know that did I define biophilic design, because I think sometimes I know those words can sound kind of, a little bit strange, biophilia. But
yeah,
biophilic
definitely very new to me personally. Biophilia, biophilic design, they sound very new to me, but I think that you gave a good, if not definition, description of what biophilic design means and how it feels. And I happen to hear a lot of people say when they walk around Tokyo or Osaka or other big cities here in Japan, and I hear them comment that, well, there is so much glass, there is so much aluminum here, everything is so shiny, but it looks so artificial. And I now realize why there is so much glass in the facades of the buildings here. I'm talking about the new buildings, the ones that have been built during the past maybe 6 or 7 years. And to me, it makes a lot of sense now. And of course, I like new buildings too, how they look, how shiny they are, how clean they are. And some of my favorite districts in Tokyo are basically the new ones, like Marunouchi. And let's say, probably Shibuya will be one of them. Not at the moment, it's very messy, but still. So I just wanted to make this point that when we see the facades of these new buildings, we do not realize how much those facades are actually connected to the feeling of nature or to bringing the nature inside. so they look artificial, they look human-made and so on. But obviously, there is that paradox there, as you said, so people feel connected with nature through the glass that is there.
Yeah, hopefully, because sometimes there are examples of glass towers that do it wrong all over the world, not just Japan. And what I mean by that is simply they don't have any kind of shading. And by shading, usually it's a projection over the window on the outside of the building, a shading device that can block the harsh summer sunlight. That's when the sun is highest in the air and can shine into the south side of a building in this northern hemisphere and overheat the building. And so they put shades down on the inside of the building, which is too late, too little too late. First of all, you're blocking all the views and you're blocking the access to daylight just to generally light the space. And then you also already accepted the heat. It's already passed through the glass and entered into the building. So you have to cool that heated air with air conditioning, increasing our use of fossil fuels. And so then what they do is they select glass that's really dark. And so it's like putting sunglasses on. So if you put sunglasses on your building in order to block the harsh light that you failed to design for with cantilevers and overhangs and shading devices, then you've just missed the whole point. So these are buildings you go into that are, and I went into some recently that are just so dark inside because all of the daylight is blocked out because it was never designed for. So it can be done well in glass high-rise towers, and it can be done very poorly. It's all about understanding climate and orientation of the building and which facades we need to work on in that way and which ones we don't need to. We don't need to deal with that much on usually the east and west sides. We might have less glazing on those sides for the reasons stated earlier. But yeah, it can be done quite well and in modern buildings, but you really have to have a lead designer, somebody who understands that, and that's not always the case. You don't know who's your mileage may vary, as we say in the US.
Well, that's a great point, because the office I worked in until last year, April last year, so the building was actually, I think it was more than 30 years old. And still it had windows on, I think windows, really wall windows on, probably they were the northern and also the southern sides. Actually, 3 sides of the building, they were, windows. And the funny thing is that from two opposing sides, we could see all the trees out there and a lot of greenery that was planted around the building. The sad thing, though, was that most of the time, those windows, they had blinds on them. And it was kind of strange because even though we could let a lot of natural light come in, so the blinds were there most of the time, and we used artificial lighting. So
I see. Yeah, that's too bad. Yeah,
it is too bad.
The building I work in has automated exterior louvers, and so they're quite wide. I don't know. Maybe they're 150 millimeters. I'm just guessing, and they're automated, so they slowly, just every once in a while. The only unfortunate part is you can hear them if you're close to them. They make a sound for a few seconds while they move. They just adjust a tiny bit because they know where the sun is exactly in the sky, because they were geo-positioned when they were designed, 20 years ago. And so you can do it well, and you're also blocking that light, blocking that sun that can enter the building on the east. And this is also east and west facades are glazed on this building, and still accept light. So you get sunlight that hits the louver, bounces up into the space off the ceiling and down into so lots of daylight, and you can still see out if you move up towards the glass close enough, and depending on the time of day. And
right.
And meanwhile, for example, the east one in the morning is doing that, and the west one is completely down. And at some point, probably afternoon, in the daytime, the west ones climb up from the bottom, so they were completely hidden, climb up, and then slowly adjust to block the sun as it lowers into the sky. So this connection to daylight, though, is not anything really new or surprising. We just maybe didn't call it biophilic design when we were young, or when I was young. I think we we just knew that there was a relationship. There were early studies in the 90s that the gentleman I mentioned earlier, Bill Browning, he wrote a book with Joseph J. Rahm from the Department of Energy on lean and mean, cutting pollution, something like reducing pollution while increasing profits. It changed my whole career, and I read it in 94, and the whole idea that there was the first accidental green Walmart. I call it accidental because I don't know if you've heard this story or not, but it's short. There was a Walmart in, I think it was Lawrence, Kansas, that they put some skylights in the building at the insistence of probably an architect who said, you've got this big volume, this big box of space, and if you just put some skylights in here, we could reduce the electrical lighting load, and you wouldn't need lights basically during daylight hours and save energy. This is before LED was really popular, of course, and I think you're looking at fluorescent lights. So Walmart agreed, and they put these skylights in just a part of the building. It wasn't even half of the building. I think it was less than a quarter. And what happened was phenomenal. At that time, in the 90s, all Walmarts were connected together, and they probably still are, connected by a computer to the headquarters. I forget where that is. Somebody might know on the chat today, but the central headquarters, somewhere in the Southwest, I believe. In any case, the main office called this Lawrence, Kansas Walmart at the end of the day after they opened and said, there's a problem with our data. It looks like men's socks or something like that, I can't remember the product, are selling like at a phenomenal rate. They're like 4 times what they normally are in your store, and they're double what they are anywhere nationally. So something's wrong. And so after some months of this kind of experience happening, home office calling the Lawrence, Kansas, they kept switching products that were under the skylights. And every time they did it, the sales of the products under the skylights sold much higher rates than anywhere in the nation. Whatever it was. It didn't matter what it was. The point was, we are tuned to this ever-changing. If you've ever played with a light meter, you can download free apps that are light meters on your iPhone. If you don't understand lux and lumens, and that's okay, you don't need to understand those. But just look at the numbers. Hold your iPhone with a light meter near daylight or in daylight, whether you're outside or standing by a window, and you'll see that the number never stops. It's always moving, because daylight and its quality is constantly changing. Of course, filtered by particulate, partly from us, but partly naturally occurring, and then also just the quality of the light, because the Earth is moving, of course, and we're moving around the sun. So as we spin through space, it's constantly changing. Now, if you do the same experiment under artificial light, just take your iPhone and go somewhere where there's no daylight, or just it's nighttime and stick it under an artificial light, it stops immediately, fixes on a number, and you get this constant light. And so the color of the light is critical to our human eye, and it has a connection to our brain, of course. And so what we do then is we process something that we realize is good. We feel, again, sort of chemically, if you will, connected to nature in this way that inspires us. And so it's not just about, people mix up sunlight and daylight, so we don't want to confuse those two. Those are very different, and for different purposes have different meanings to us in different seasons.
Right. And James, I was wondering, so in my head at least, when I think about bringing nature inside, I think about having some pots of plants indoors, right? And this is the only image I get in my head. But when you say bringing nature inside or nature inside, what are some ways of doing that? Well, and I'm talking about public buildings or administrative buildings here, because that's where most people here spend most of their time during the day, and even during the night.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. I'm glad you said it, Maya, because it's something I'm always trying to push with some design professionals in my both my firm, but also really others that are working outside my firm, where we're trying to educate the design world. But you don't have to bring plants in. I have to tell you a very quick story about a building that I think you can access in Osaka. If you're in Osaka on a weekend or a holiday, you should really try to go to Yanmar headquarters in Osaka. I think it's Namba station area. And this is a building that when I toured it, 2016, early 2017 maybe, I came out of there. I didn't see a single plant, by the way. And that's not a single plant. And I used the word to one of my colleagues, and I said, that's got to be the most biophilic building I've ever seen in my life. And he said, what? What's biophilic? So we started talking about that. My sound here is changing a little bit because I changed my room. I'm looking for a way to go outside since we're talking about outside. Anyway, the way this building, if it's too loud for background noise being outside, you guys, this project used biophilic design was in colors, patterns, textures, shapes, products selected, the organization of walls. For example, I saw carpeting that I swear looked like if you were a drone or you were in an airplane looking, helicopter maybe is better, looking down on a wheat field and the wind was blowing across it, you would swear this carpet pattern was almost moving. And I saw one with a bluish river, like a stream running through a conference room. The walls of the conference room, one was tilted at about 15 degrees and it was thick, like a thick wall, white, rounded at the top and as it met the floor at the bottom, and it like this, and dark black walls on some of the walls, but then a bright red color viewed through daylight. And everything I saw in this building was like feeling a connection to nature. And when you go to the top floor, if I haven't told you about this building in the past conversations, top floor I think the public can really get to besides the ground floor, which is interesting in and of itself. But the top floor, there's this 8-meter diameter glass room, and there's a tree in the middle and some wooden crates laying around. And you look at it and you go, what is this? This is really a waste of space. All this, and there's daylight coming sky, this 8-meter diameter glass room. And when you get close to the glass, you can see there's thousands of honeybees flying around in there. Because this company, Yanmar, is an agriculture company. Yanmar is dragonfly. So their whole history, and dragonfly is a symbol of a good harvest coming in the spring. So I hear a construction outside, so I'm moving back in. In any case, this is an example of not having to bring all kinds of plants and water into the building. Although they do have a conference room on the ground floor of that building that the public again can access, and it's just a room made of glass, and on two faces of the glass, one on the outside of the building, one on the inside, water is continuously running down them. And I'm like, what is the purpose of this? It's not even on a floor with the offices. It's just a room to decompress, to go into where water is falling, and you can sit there and not really be seen as sort of a blur through the waterfall, and relax, take stress away. So it's quite interesting that you don't need to have a bunch of plants. So that's why in Bill Browning's book, Nature Inside, he talks about nature analogs, and that's what I just described to you. All of those examples at the Yanmar building are nature analogs. And they used a lot of them with the history of being an agricultural machine company. And then there is nature, bringing literally nature inside. And a great example of that is a recent International Biophilic Design Award winner, Kumamoto Station. In Kumamoto has one of the most fantastic 3D 8-story vertical garden inside. And you can probably find it via Google, because that award, there's a video and some information about it online by the International Living Futures Institute. But it's just loaded with plants and rocks and waterfalls, giant, I think there's a 10-meter high at the highest waterfall running through glass and stone. It's just an unbelievable sound. You can even feel the air movement from the waterfalls, and so the leaves are moving on the plants that are on the walls. This is a total nature inside experience, which is really almost the opposite spectrum of Yanmar building, but both equally successful in my mind.
Well, that's fascinating. While listening to you, I was just thinking about the traditional Japanese houses that most of them are open, and they have actually those doors that open to the gardens, and you can actually let your garden in by opening the doors. And how that tradition, or if that tradition has actually been carried on in the new architectural designs here. And I wonder, because as you mentioned, of course, it depends on the execution, the thought put into it, and the designs. Of course, a glass facade can work, and it may work, it may not work, depending on different things. But do you think that there is something that is there is some connection between those traditional designs here in Japan and the new designs, the new architecture that is being built here? Because, as you said, there are different ways of letting nature in, and sometimes you don't have to actually have plants inside to feel that the design is biophilic.
Yes.
And sometimes you have all the plants and water running throughout the building and the floors, so that you get the feeling that you're in a garden.
Yes. I just gathered a bunch of slides yesterday showing images of traditional Japanese homes you're describing, Maya, and I'm talking about in this presentation, I think I'm going to talk about framing views, which I found the Japanese are masters at. And I actually first learned it from Frank Lloyd Wright, who you'd go into a Frank Lloyd Wright prairie-style house in America, and you'd sit down in one of the chairs that you're allowed to sit on, or at the same height as one of the chairs that he had designed, and you'd realize that he designed, when you're in a seated position in this room, framing this horizontal view of a landscape, distant Wisconsin, landscape at Taliesin or in Arizona, and unbelievable. He learned that, I'm quite sure, from the Japanese. There is a book called Frank Lloyd Wright in Japan, endorsed by the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, but while Frank denied being influenced by Japanese architecture, he was a collector of Japanese art, and one of the biggest collection. Actually, he had the biggest collection of Japanese art outside of Japan, and he made more money selling that art than he did from architecture in his entire career. And so his connection really brought my eye to Japan, but I think all Japanese houses at the time, the whole idea of the engawa is really indoor space, but it's on the outside of the house, right? That's why your shoes aren't really worn on traditional engawa. And today, in fact, I'm showing a few slides in this presentation I'm giving in Washington, D.C. in a few weeks. I'm showing a few images of new buildings where, yes, it's not truly an engawa like we would have on a home, but we could see new buildings like the new Kyoto City Hall branch building, which has on a roof garden. But when you step outside onto that roof garden, I can't remember which level, 4th floor or 3rd floor. When you step out onto it, there's an engawa there, but you feel like, and it looks like, almost the appearance of a traditional Japanese home from the outside. On the inside, it looks like a traditional office. But when you step out onto this engawa and then look back or along the engawa, you feel this connection to the historic sort of design. So there's also an airport in Shimojishima. Kuko is really interesting design. It's the first airport outside of these tiny little airports I used to go to in Mexico every year, where it was just a hut, that you came through to check in. And outside of those, this is the first real international terminal that can open up to the outside, and all of the waiting area is facing inward to a pool and trees, and the whole walls open up much like a shoji would and slide open to these beautiful views, birds, and deep overhanging roofs for the heavy rains in the Okinawan Islands. And it's really, really something, because you're used to being in a glass box at an airport where you can sit there and look at planes, and if you get a breath of outside air, it's usually jet fuel smell. This is the opposite of that. It's an airport in harmony with nature. And you can find an article on that I wrote probably about 4 years ago for ULI magazine. I think it's just online.
Well, that's wonderful. And once again, while listening to you, I remembered also how beautiful a garden. There is that is the, just a moment, Shimane? Oh no, that is Adachi Museum of Art.
Oh yes, I love that place.
I love that place, yes. I remember how, it was just amazing to be there. And of course, before going there, I never expected to see what I saw. And as you mentioned, how beautifully they frame the garden views from inside, but you don't feel that you're inside actually there. It's such a beautiful place and a great example of what you were talking about just now. And
I'm glad you mentioned it. I want to look for my photos now. I've been there so many times. I must have some good images from there.
Yeah, I hope you find some good images there for the presentation you're going to make. Tim, if you want to.
Yeah. Good morning. This is my first words this morning. So good morning, everybody.
Hi,
Hi, and thanks again for coming. I love listening to you. The idea of framing it kind of brought back a memory. I took a really fascinating course in college by Professor Edward Kidder, the late Edward Kidder, and it was called Japanese Art. And it was just fascinating because he gives you historical context. He talks about architecture, art, and I remember one class he was talking about Zen gardens. And he posed the question, you see this beautiful Zen garden now, do you see these stepping stones that are connecting these parts of the garden? What is the purpose of those stepping stones? And sometimes they would be in a pond, but sometimes they wouldn't be. And I never thought about it. He goes, the person who designed this garden wants you to look down at the stepping stones because he's preparing you for the framing of your next view when you get off the stepping stones. I mean, that's how deep these were designed. So as you said, it's all about framing, right?
That's really interesting. I hadn't heard that before, and now that you say it, I'm certain there's a lot of truth to that. There has to be. This control views, not control in a negative sense, but in the most positive of senses. I actually have a term I coined that I've been using at work called controlled collisions, where we accidentally meet people at the office, and we created an entire floor now for what I call controlled collisions, and it's just a collaboration space of it's more like a lounge, looks more like an airport lounge with lots of plants and exhibits. But it's all about controlling meeting people. But this controlling views and framing views is not exclusively a Japanese thing, but certainly is really exemplified in traditional architecture here. And others have picked up on it. Other architects have picked it up and carried it forward as well.
Yeah, and you don't even realize you're being controlled. And actually, the next view is being staged for you. Almost at the subliminal level, which makes it, in my opinion, just genius. It's very interesting. And then, you were talking about, traditional Japanese homes. And I remember one of the first books I read about Japan was by Edwin Reischauer. I think it was Tradition and Transformation. And he was talking about Japanese architecture. And he said, it kind of doesn't make sense because it has this tropical vibe to it. And considering some of the harsh winters that, in certain parts of Japan, certainly Hokkaido and the northern part of Honshu, the downside, and I had the pleasure of living in a Japanese house once. The downside is it also brings in the cold in the winter.
For sure.
And that's something you just had to put up with. So to that point, the point about bringing nature inside without necessarily having plants. So back in the mid-'90s, I was working for a consulting company, and one of our clients, have you ever heard of Cummins, the engine manufacturer?
Oh, yes.
Okay. In Columbus, Indiana. And Cummins is this very interesting, unique company. They are really into sustainability, even back in the 90s, in architecture. And they had a very close relationship with the town of Columbus, Indiana. And Columbus, Indiana had architectural standards. So if anybody came into town and built a building, they had to be approved by their council that they had, right?
Oh, yes.
And
I've been on those boards,
Yeah, but Cummins would offer to pay for the architecture fees of anybody who came into town.
Wow.
And so it was this really beautiful little Indiana town. So absolutely the most beautiful factory I've ever worked at. They were making diesel engines for the Ram truck, right? The Dodge Ram truck. And business was booming. So they brought us in to help increase their throughput on their diesel engines. And so this building, as you approach it, you can't even see it. It's it's surrounded by trees and forest, okay?
Wow.
And the parking lot is on the roof. So you drive up a ramp, and then you take an elevator down into the plant. Cool. And the plant, all around the plant are the offices, and it's all glass. So you see the green surrounding the entire factory. And then in the middle is this huge atrium, an outdoor, filled with plants and trees. So no matter which way you look, there's green everywhere. And that's another example of bringing nature into a factory of all places, right?
Wow.
So anyway, I thought that was
great. I can't believe I haven't heard of that building. It sounds too fantastic and such a great idea to, park on the roof. Why make a big asphalt parking lot and take up more green space? What a great idea.
Yeah.
And factories, they're just historically these, huge spaces, voluminous spaces, and which also I can't ever understand why they're not better daylit. Is often the case. Unless you look back at really old factories, there's some great examples of really old sort of World War II era factories where there was great daylighting up high, very high in the factory floor, daylight spilling into the building. But interesting.
Indeed.
Something you said about homes, I was going to make a point that this idea of old Japanese farmhouses, and I also had a chance to stay in some old homes a few times, and you were talking about how leaky these homes, of course, when they're made of paper and straw and some thin wood panels to slide over the shoji screens that are filtering the daylight, you're going to get leaky, pretty drafty homes. And historically, when we had how do you say the old charcoal fire pit built into the floor, the irori, I think.
Irori, yes.
Yeah. This was necessary for human health and survival, that they were leaky. They weren't designed to be leaky, they just were leaky, so there was no problem bringing, charcoal into the house, cooking a meal, and then sliding the table over it to make a little heated, nice. Yeah. So I think, this idea, I may have mentioned this in our pre-meeting kind of discussion, but this idea that we should heat the people, not the entire space or volume of the house, is really really intelligent. I think it's coming back, because I actually saw an example. I think it was a small branch bank somewhere in the Kansai region. I'm not remembering where, the name of the bank, but they had a very small lobby, but their seating was cooled. It was chilled. So they had this permanent built-in bench. I can't remember if the fabric covering, if there was one, or how they accommodated comfort, but it was basically a chilled bench seating, the back and the seat area, and basically cooling the people. Why cool this volume of space and waste all that energy when we could just cool the people? And that's all we need enough energy for. So I think it was billed to me as this incredibly energy efficient branch bank. You got to go see it, James, because it's got this cooled seating. Which I love the idea.
Yes. And James, we have, of course, I can also see, I thought that Timothy had a question or something to add, but before that, Timothy, if you give me just a few minutes, we have a comment from David in the room chat, and it is about cultural challenges marketing the idea of biophilic design to a Japanese customer base. And it is, so are there any challenges? Because we know that in Japan there is a certain fear of nature because of the earthquakes, typhoons, and let's say floods as well. So it's a big part of the mindset here. So have you felt that there are any challenges of marketing the idea of biophilic design here in Japan? I guess it's probably a little bit out of your field because we're talking about marketing, but just what's your feel of that?
Well, I think certainly marketing, and if you change the word marketing to sales even, for example, we're faced with it all the time in architecture profession, because we're selling the idea of a concept, whatever design concept it might be, and there's obviously more than one for every project and solution, but I'm not at the front lines of selling some of the designs I've talked about here today, so I haven't experienced any kind of quote-unquote rejection. And I do get the comment that, oh yes, well, it's very easy to sell a natural environment to Myanmar, who is, and that's their business, is sustainable food for humans. and they need to make machines to sell to farmers to grow food, so they're connected to the earth. It's going to be so easy to do that. I think it would be not so hard to market or promote or sell ideas around biophilic design to Japanese because of the history. If you only look at the history of sort of Japanese design, traditional temple, shrine, and housing design, not high-rise office towers, that's where we are today, but you could probably make a pretty strong case that this is your history, this is our history, this is design. Again, biologically connected we are to nature, and I think it wouldn't, in my mind, it wouldn't be so difficult to sell. Now, to get somebody to invest a lot of money, when somebody asked me, what about this Kumamoto station, 3-dimensional garden, 8 stories high with plants on the walls, 1 year of test growing them and simulating all the waterfall sound and air movement, and how do you sell a client to do that? Well, I didn't say, but like many stations of the nearly 8,600 stations in Japan that want to be a destination station, I call it, they really need something to keep people there. And if you think about it, when the shops wrapping around this atrium are ready to be leased, and you look at this kind of space, you think, people are going to stay here. People are going to sit here. People are going to want to be here. They're going to want to meet friends here. They're going to want to shop here. It makes just total sense, much like the daylighting story in Walmart. So once you're able to connect the bottom line to the idea of biophilia and how people who are happier and are more productive, and they are happier, remember the 5 things I said people want most? All of them are nature in their office. So if you make the connection that, well, let's see, if people want to come back to the office post-COVID, they want a connection to the outdoors, they want more plants, they want more daylight, they want more color, they want to live. They want to live like we used to live, naturally. So it's really simple. They'll be more productive, they'll be happier, they'll come to the office more. All of that is going to be true, making the bottom line better for the company and better for the individual.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that. And Timothy, I apologize for keeping you waiting.
Gosh.
Yes, I know.
I had 2 cups of coffee, so I'm going to talk real quick.
Okay, go on.
So James, this is really an interesting topic, interesting background. You described things so very well. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you.
You've mentioned Frank Lloyd Wright several times, and I'm really interested in his influence here in Japan and his influence on you. Could you talk just a little bit about that? Because he was so influential, but I know some of the buildings that he designed, but from an architect's point of view, I really don't well understand the impact that he's had here in Japan. Could you kind of touch on that?
Yes, I'll try to be brief. Growing up in northern Wisconsin and Minnesota, my parents were fans of these strange places like House on the Rock, if you've ever heard of that, or maybe, I don't even know if it still exists, or like, I don't know, what was Al Capone's hideout? And so they were, in a way, they were architectural places, Cave of the Mounds, and I think that was in the Dakotas. Anyway, they would drag us kids to these places, which I absolutely hated. And they did end up dragging us through some Frank Lloyd Wright houses. And I didn't know as a child that I would become an architect. And later, when I started studying architecture and I looked at Frank Lloyd Wright's work, I was impressed. But it was that connection to Japan that when I learned about that, I went, you know what? I can't believe this boy from Wisconsin, knew all this and learned it himself here. So I'm going to go over there to Japan and check on what he was influenced by. So I've not always been really kind to Frank. He deserves more credit than I give him, but he did have an influence on me because his work was beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. He wrote the book, I think it's called The Natural House, something like that, the title, that I read at a young age. And I would argue that book is really just it's almost the same as Edward Morse's book on the Japanese, what's it called? Japanese Homes and Their Surroundings by Edward Morse, 1889 or something like that. So I would argue that book and are similar. They can be compared, but not the same book, a very different style of writing and so forth. But yeah, Frank is obviously maybe the most well-known architect around the world.
So in addition to the Prime Minister's residence and the Imperial Hotel, which which was demolished. He designed that. What other kind of important buildings around did Frank Lloyd Wright actually design or build?
There's a lot, and there's actually more in Japan that I even have ever looked up or sought to even try and find if they're still existing. But my favorite of his buildings was the Johnson Wax building in Racine, Wisconsin. But because it was an office environment, not just a private residence, which is wonderful. And again, great designs, lots of private residences. But that project, it is the epitome of daylighting, good daylighting. And the whole structural design of those, I call them, now I'm forgetting the English word for lily pad. There's lily pad structures. I don't know if anybody can visualize this building. Big round lily pads are the roof of the building, and they come into this narrow stem down to the floor made of concrete. And the building code officials thought it wouldn't work. And again, Frank engineered this himself. He didn't have a structural engineer doing this design. And then they piled up sandbags on top of them in a live test that the code officials ordered for him because they didn't believe that it would support the roof under snow loads and so forth in Wisconsin. And they not only held the loads that were anticipated, I think they held like 2 or 3 times whatever the maximum was before failing. And really a wonderful, one of the first open office experiences, but so well done. Quite a beautiful building. If you have a chance to see that one, or look it up online, I'm sure there's a lot online about it. The other building that is impressive is Unity Temple. But I may have told some of you this before, but if you look at the book Frank Lloyd Wright in Japan, I think you could probably find this image online just with a Google search. But Unity Temple, and there's a temple in Nikko in Japan, and you can overlay the floor plans, and you can't tell them apart. They have exactly the same floor plan. It's actually a different scale, but when you compare them at the same exact scale, you can overlay one over the other and not see if there was if it was drawn on glass and laid one over the top of the other, you couldn't see the difference. This is the same floor plan. So, and obviously Frank's is done long after this temple in Nikko was built. So, that's not to shed any sort of darkness on his work, and it's in architecture, just like much in art, it's all been done before. In the famous words of the Bare Naked Ladies band from Canada, it's all been done before. And so most architecture is of course going to repeat scales and patterns that work, and it's going to repeat heights that work for human dimensions, and the door widths are going to be similar. So many patterns of recognition that we have in buildings are designed based on humans and our occupancy of them and the function of what's going to occur in that room. So there are going to be patterns, even accidentally, that look exactly the same. And uses of materials too. When somebody brilliantly uses wood or glass or stone or plaster, somebody else is going to do that same thing. So I don't want to make Frank look like some kind of plagiarist. I think he was influenced in profound ways that he wouldn't even recognize.
Yeah. I Googled Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings in Japan, so I put the link in the room chat, and actually some of it surprised me. I didn't realize it. The Imperial Hotel was mentioned, the U.S. Embassy, Odawara Hotel that in 1917, which that blew me away. I didn't know that. So they're in Jiu Gakuen School in Tokyo, 1921. I think it's like 14 different buildings. So this is all new information for me. Very interesting.
Yeah. I think that relationship is really wonderful, and I'm happy that he had it with Japan. He had this great relationship, albeit he had a huge fight with the Imperial Hotel people just a couple years before completion of the building, and because of that, he wasn't here for the grand opening on September 1st, 1923, the day of the great earthquake that leveled Tokyo. So the 100th anniversary coming up this September 1st of that.
Yes, thank you, James, for that. For the explanation. Then one more question I have, and I was thinking probably it's along the lines that not exactly, but a kind of similar question to the one David had. So you mentioned that biophilic design. People are not familiar with the term, And usually, when you hear the word biophilic design, you wonder, what's this? That's what I felt, that's what I thought when you first mentioned the term to me. And so I wonder, is it that people are not familiar with the terminology that it makes it a kind of difficult for this trend to spread more rapidly here or throughout the world? Is there a way around that?
It's a great question. I think, because I've only ever been able to use katakana to talk about biophilia and biophilic and define bio in philia, love and life and nature. And then otherwise you're resorting in Japan at least to other words, sort of shizen and things that maybe are, I don't know how to compound words, if you will, piecing them together. So I'm sure there's a way around it. And again, my colleagues told me that at the Yanmar project, there was never a mention of biophilia, nor was there actually really a direct mention of nature. They didn't really have to, it just came, to the customer and the design team sort of, for lack of a better word, naturally. I'm sure, we sell ideas around energy efficiency all the time. We sell based on something else, based on, for example, cost savings, but we're really focused on carbon emissions. But some customers want you to reduce their carbon emissions and don't care about cost because they know that the smallest cost is their energy cost and their biggest cost is their people and the fear of legislation or rules that will fine them for carbon emissions. So, yeah, it kind of depends, right? I think if you think about each person and what resonates with you, it probably is just a little bit different with each customer. Some might love the idea of biophilia or biophilic design, or others might be sold on just connecting to nature, whereas, again, others, another angle.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely a topic, and the whole thing about biophilia, I think that we need a whole other room to actually, finish all the questions and also talk more about it, because I'm sure that there is so much more to say about the concept and how it is applied here in Japan, how it is integrated in modern architecture and traditional architecture as well. So thank you so very much, James, for your time.
You're welcome.
Wednesday morning. Tim and Timothy, everybody else who came here, and for sharing your thoughts and the links as well.
Yeah, what a great presentation. As always, I always enjoy talking to you, James, so thank you so much for sharing your knowledge.
You're too kind, Tim. Thank you.
Most everybody in the room now is thinking exactly along the lines of Tim's anyway. So thank you very much once again, everybody. I wish you a bright day and a great reminder of the week. Stay with us or come to Clubhouse again on Sunday morning 8:20 when we have the Japanese politics with Timothy Langley, so you can follow the story of what is happening in Japan. And next week on Wednesday at 8 o'clock we'll be here once again with Tim Sullivan. So thanks and have a great day.